Let me first welcome you all, and this is we are you might say celebrating 1 year after the collapse of Lehman Brothers, and I suppose you might say we're celebrating that we didn't go into a deep depression, but the collapse of Lehman Brothers raises a large number of problems about economics, about economic policy. What I don't want to foreshadow what the various panelists are going to say. Clearly, in the aftermath, the U.S. went into a deep recession, but it's become a global recession, so it's obviously there have been global consequences. But there are a whole series of questions, more specific questions that are raised. For instance, one of them is, would we have had the economic downturn even if Lehman Brothers? It's a nice story, it's a dramatic story, but actually there are many people who believe that in fact we would be in a recession anyway. There are those who have been arguing that the failure of the administration and the Federal Reserve to deal adequately with Lehman Brothers was a blessing in disguise because it was a wake-up call. So it was sort of like the patient got so sick that we decided to do something. So that's another view of what happened. The third question in terms of what happened is, did they have any choice? The administration and the Fed, ex post, have said they had no legal authority to do anything other than that. I think that's wrong, and most people else, but it's one that has gotten some currency. So that's looking back, but I think the most interest is looking forward and asking questions like, are we out of the woods, as some people in the administration would like one to believe? Is our financial system better, or actually, as some people like I've been arguing, it's actually probably in worse shape in certain critical areas that we really haven't done what we should have done. So, and that raised the question of where will we be going from here. So both on the policy front and in terms of where the economy is going. So there are a huge host of questions that this first anniversary of Lehman Brothers raises. And the Committee of Global Thought particularly raises this question because the issues it has become a global crisis and it has become a source of discussion globally. The reforms that have been taken in other countries have been markedly, in some cases, been different from that of the United States. Certainly, France has been much more outspoken about doing something about the bonuses than the U.S. administration. So there are big policy issues being debated around the world. G20 has become a new force for discussions and criticisms of that, its legitimacy as well. So with these just very brief introductory remarks, let me turn it over to Saskia.
Yes. Well, welcome to all. It's great that you're all here. We have three enormously distinguished and very different economists, thinkers, physicists, to address some of these questions. And one of the projects of this panel, which is part of a series of panels, is to, in fact, if you want, go behind the level at which a lot of this discussion has happened. There is a question of regulatory capture. Regulators have seemed to have little appetite to really look. But then there is a deeper question, which is what are the models that have been used? What are the notions of risk? In a way, many regulators around the world, I would like to actually confine this to Western regulators, because I don't know exactly, but maybe you will enlighten us what the discussion is, say, in China about questions of regulation. But many regulators in the West think US, think UK, which are indeed very different from France and from Germany, are still debating something that is already completely broken. You know, how could we? And I would also add that even though Obama's visit yesterday was greeted by many people, this is just too late, he missed his moment, there is a deeper level of analysis that we need to get at. And I mean, one sort of way of putting it in a starting point is that Western policymakers, I don't want to say economists, all right, but Western policymakers are at a moment of intellectual crisis, you know. And it's not that we in this panel, by the way, are going to solve that crisis. That is not at all the intention. But there is this issue of regulatory capture, and this then raises the question of what type of framework would work. Now, one might well say that it is in the nature of finance not to be ever susceptible to complete taming, if you want. Finance is forever building on its innovations, building on its crises. So the question of regulation cannot be what it was for traditional banking. And probably one of the issues is to maintain a stronger distinction. There is a question of pricing logics. And I think that the Lehman bankruptcy made visible something that many already knew, which was the difficulty of actually reconstructing how a certain price had been achieved, the impossibility of actually valuing what Lehman still had. You know, these are all incredibly, actually deep questions, you know, that academics should be addressing. Today, another question I would think is the obstacles, intellectual and political. It's not only political, that we face to prevent at least a repeat of what has happened. More difficult to prevent a future crisis whose architecture we haven't even thought about, you know, because that is, of course, what keeps happening. And if you look at the last 20 years of crises, quite a bit of variation in those crises. You know, they were not all the same type of crises. Big question, and I'm hoping again that Professor Yu can address that. What do we think are the sources of growth in post-crisis global economy? The question of unemployment keeps growing, keeps becoming more important, even as some of the financial actors are doing extremely well. So I thought that for the way we'll organize a discussion is each of our speakers will sort of address some of the fundamental issues that they have worked on, and only in 10 minutes, if that is possible. I know that is always tough, but if I told you 15, you would take it to 20. So now I'm just, you know, if you go up to 15, I will be completely happy here. And perhaps one first question that you can all address from your own, from your own perspective is, what are the analytics, if you want, behind your interpretation of the crisis and your also thoughts about how we should move it? In your case, and Professor Derman will start, it is, of course, a question of modeling risk versus risk management. I'm going to now give brief introductions, also of Joe. Joe, since you're also a panelist. Did you know that? Mm-hmm. Oh, okay, well, that's very good then. So Professor Derman joined Columbia University's Industrial Engineering and Operations Research Department in 2003. Prior to joining Columbia, he was a managing director at Goldman Sachs, where he was head of the quantitative strategies group in the equities division for 10 years, and then became head of quantitative risk strategies group in the firm-wide risk department. He was the International Association of Financial Engineers Sangard Financial Engineer of the Year in 2000. Professor Derman's research interests include quantitative finance, financial engineering, derivatives valuation, volatility models, and risk management. His recent memoir, a book I love, which I thought was extraordinary, My Life as a Quant, I'm sure many of you have read this, Reflections on Physics and Finance, which is also a great second title in that book, was published in 2004 and was selected as one of Business Week's top 10 books of the year. Why don't you start speaking?
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here. I was actually going to, tell me when I get to 10 minutes and then I'll take another 3. Okay, but
It's
I
a
was
deal.
going to try to talk a little bit. I'm not really an economist. I sort of started out as a physicist, and then I learned financial modeling and financial economics from the bottom up by working on the job. And I want to talk a little bit today about the difference. Let me see if I can work this thing, about the difference between financial models and financial theories and physics models and physics theories. So I want to talk a little bit generally about what we mean by models, what makes a theory, models in finance. I won't waste time. I'm going to go through all these things, and if I get time, I'll talk a little bit about what I think is the right way to use these models and the crisis maybe later. So I want to talk a little bit about what we mean by models. And when I was a kid, I used to build model airplanes. I don't know whether there are people here my age who worked with balsa wood and cut frames out and glued them together, but I spent a lot of time on this. And just to be brief, why do you call it a model airplane? And why do you use a model? Why do you use the word model in other ways as well? Artist model, fashion model, the standard model, which is actually the foundation of particle physics these days, and weak and strong interactions. And I think that's a misnomer, but it seems to me the reason why I use a model is that a model isn't the real thing. If you look at a model airplane, it flies, it's made out of bolts, it flies, it looks like an airplane, but it's smaller, it's made differently. It only captures some parts of the real thing, and that's why it's called a model. The same thing with an artist model, which you're only interested in the appearance, not in the inside. The same with the fashion model. I saw an article in the paper yesterday that somebody suggested that it was okay for fashion models to be very skinny because they should just serve as clothes hangers. No, seriously, there was a letter to the Times. So one isn't interested in the whole person, one's interested in only a part of them. And if you look at my third bullet point, I'm saying models really only focus on the parts of things. They sort of like sexual fetishes. They exaggerate the importance of the parts of a person rather than the whole person themselves. And they reduce the dimensionality of a very complex system into something much simpler and allow you to then use the model to extrapolate. So models are analogies, and what models do is allow you to say, I'm going to come to this some more a little bit later, they allow you to say, if I want to understand this thing over here, I can really think of it a lot as being like that other thing I already understand. I'm going to expand upon this in a little while. And so I want to argue that models, unlike theories, are really metaphors, and they always of limited applicability. They're always making comparisons between things you'd like to understand to things you already do understand. People say the brain is a neural net, but they don't really mean that. They say the financial system is like a neural net. But they think a neural net isn't the brain, it's like the brain in some sense, and the financial system isn't a neural net, it's like a neural net. Okay, so what I really want to say at the bottom there is that models, there's always a gap, in my view, between a model and between the thing you're actually trying to represent. Let me watch the clock. Oops. Well, now I've got a problem.
Can somebody?
I can talk without it, but that's okay if you give me my notes. Okay, so I was going to talk a little bit about models in general, and I was going to start by talking about physics models. Physics models are different from financial models. In physics, the aim is really divination, or foretelling the future and trying to control it. And people have two ways. Sorry, let me just regroup myself. Okay, so I was going to say, let me give you an example of a physics model that's a metaphor. There's a model that people got the Nobel Prize for sometime in the 50s, Bohr's son, and it's called the liquid drop model of the nucleus. And the nucleus is the core inside the atom at the center, and it really consists of protons and neutrons and great complexity. Thank you. Okay, but in some approximation, people built a model that said the center of the nucleus is like a liquid drop made out of very dense material that can vibrate and rotate and oscillate, and it's a useful way of thinking about it. But it's a metaphor. The nucleus isn't a liquid drop. A liquid drop is a liquid drop. The nucleus is like a liquid drop. So I want to stress that it's only suitable in a certain range of approximation. If you want to see, there's a non-physics metaphor model that I like. It's from Schopenhauer. He says, sleep is the interest we have to pay on the capital that's called in a debt, and the higher the rate of interest and the more regularly it is paid, and I can't see it from here, the further the date of redemption is postponed. It's a very nice explanation of sleep as a loan from infinity, from the void, but it's a metaphor, although a kind of insightful one. If you want to see what I think is a non-metaphor, it's like if you read the Bible and you read the story of the burning bush, God is in a burning bush and says to Moses, who doesn't want to do his job of liberating the Israelites, and he says to the burning bush, "Who shall I say sent me?" And the guy in the bush says, "I am that which I am." There's nothing metaphorical at all. He is just exactly what he is. And I want to argue a little bit that that's what theories are. A theory is a model of part of the world, but there are two things about it in my view. One, it's got greater aspirations to the truth. It doesn't think of itself as a model. It thinks of itself as actually being the world, not just describing the world. So I think a theory is non-metaphorical and absolute in some sense, and that's why people often use mathematics. It's easier to be absolute, although you don't have to use mathematics. I'll give an example. So I don't want to get technical, but if you look at either Newton's laws, which I wrote up there on the left, or Maxwell's equations, which describe, Newton's laws describe the motion of particles and gravity and planets, and Maxwell's equations on the right describe the behavior of the electromagnetic field, and they really are, they're not metaphorical. They don't say the electromagnetic field is like these equations. If you study physics, I think you have to believe that the electromagnetic world is these equations. It's almost impossible to think about light or radio waves as being like anything, as being modeled by Maxwell's equations. They are Maxwell's equations to an incredibly good approximation, or in fact, to absolute truth. And they've got, I want to be brief, but they involve dynamics and causality and cause and effect. Newton's law says gravitational mass produces force, and force produces acceleration. So I want to argue that whereas a model is a metaphor, a theory, or a successful theory, is really almost indistinguishable from the thing it's trying to describe, which I certainly think is true of Maxwell's equations. How much time do I have?
You have 5 minutes.
Left?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so I'm going to jump over this.
That looks like it would take a bit more than.
Yes, okay. Well, I just like this because I think it's an example. It's a bit like Freud, but it's an example of a model that I think is absolute, but is not about physics. And it's Spinoza's theory of the emotions, which he tried to model the way Euclid modeled mathematics with primitives. And I don't have time, but he says everything at the bottom is based on desire, pleasure, and pain. And all the other emotions are derivatives. So for example, cruelty is the desire to inflict pain on someone you love, and someone you love is someone who gives you pleasure. So everything is a derivative, and it's absolute and stands on its own terms. It's not an analogy. He actually analyzes every single emotion, including Schadenfreude, which he doesn't name, which is pleasure at somebody else's pain. They all relate down to the bottom. So that's, I think, an example of a theory too. In finance, I've got 4 minutes left. I want to say in finance there are really only models. There aren't any theories. And the way models in finance work, in my experience, is they're always work at making an analogy and then trying to extrapolate. So for example, if you want to price an apartment on Park Avenue and you know the price of an apartment in Battery Park City, you calculate the price per square foot of the apartment in Battery Park City, and then you scale up the price per square foot times the apartment on Park Avenue, and you come up with the price. And then it's not the right price. You adjust for the environment, for the neighborhood, for the number of doormen, for the nearness to Central Park. But it's a model in the sense it says price per square foot is constant. And most financial models work that way. They try to take some simple variable and use it to extrapolate to wider ranges. And they go from liquid things like a studio in Battery Park City to illiquid things like 8-room penthouses on Park Avenue. In the same way, they go from stocks and bonds to options by extrapolation and volatility. I'm scared I'm running out of time.
No, this is.
Okay, so I want to say in finance, let me concentrate on those 3 bullet points at the bottom, that models are really used to rank securities by value, to reduce them to a one-dimensional scale. Just like you say the apartment with the best price per square foot is the best, you say the bond with the best yield to maturity, or the option with the lowest implied volatility is the best or the worst. Models let you go from liquid prices to illiquid ones. They don't try to predict the future. They try to say, you tell me what the future will be like in terms of prepayment rates or volatility or price per square foot, and I'll tell you what today's price should be. Models are mostly trying in real life to predict the value of something you don't know in the present out of assumptions about the future, rather than trying in physics to tell you where a satellite is going to go if you launch it. Very different behavior with respect to time. And finally, what models are used for is to translate your intuition into dollar prices. It's very hard to have intuition about what you should pay for a security. It's much easier to think about what will prepayments be in the future, or what will default rates be in the future, and use your model to filter that and transform it into a dollar price. Should I stop?
If you
I'm happy.
want to, that's fine to stop. I just wanted to add, well, thank you.
Okay.
Yes.
I'm happy to say more later. I don't want to take anybody's time.
Okay, you're
thank
very
you.
kind. Thank you. Before we move on to the next speaker, I just wanted to put one question in the air that maybe you can address later on. Somewhere I read that you said that economists do not know the limits of their models, whereas physicists do know the limits of their models. But maybe this is not the time to...
Can I say one thing?
Yeah.
I said something a little worse, actually, which is that economists have never seen a really successful model, so they don't know what one is. And physicists, for better or for worse, have seen. It doesn't make economics worse than physics. It's just that physics is very amenable to this, and physicists have seen models that predict the precession of an electron to 10 decimal places, and economists. The field is incapable of that, and so they don't really have a good feel for what's possible and they don't even have a feel for what success is.
So we may want to return to some of these limitations, let's say, in the discussion later on. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Luigi Zingales, who is the Robert McCormack Professor of Entrepreneurship and Finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He's also a faculty research fellow for the National Bureau of Economic Research, a research fellow for the Center for Economic Policy Research, and a fellow of the European Governance Institute. Zingales serves on the Committee on Capital Markets Regulation, which has been examining the legislative, regulatory, and legal issues affecting how public companies function. His research has earned him the 2003 Bernatzer Prize for the Best European Young Financial Economist, the 2002 NASDAQ Award for Best Paper in Capital Formation, and the National Science Foundation Grant in Economics. He studies the theory of the firm, the relation between organization and financing, and the going public decision. Professor Zingales.
Thank you. I don't have any slides, but I prefer to speak from here because it's easier. So when I think about the different interpretation or causes of the crisis that people have advanced, it reminds me of the famous sort of psychological experiment that people have done, where they present a piece of evidence to a bunch of students with different views, and each one interprets that as proof of their own point. And I think that the crisis has been used by a lot of people trying to say, I was right. I remember that when I testified in front of Congress on the causes of Lehman collapse, there was Nell Minov, a shareholders activist, that said, it's all executive compensation. I told you so, and this is the cause of the crisis. Now, I think that's potentially a good idea. Now, you look at the data, there is no evidence for that. And so executive compensation might be screwed up, but they're screwed up on their own dimension, and it's not related with the crisis. On the same panel, there was Peter Williamson, I think, is from the AAI, and he was saying it's Fannie and Freddie. Absolutely. He hated Fannie and Freddie to begin with, so it's fault of Fannie and Freddie for the crisis. Now, I think that Fannie and Freddie had a lot of problems, and they've shown them. They came to the game relatively late, and they might have been in part responsible for letting it go a little bit too long. It's hard to imagine, given their level of late involvement, that they really cause all this crisis. And of course, I can go on. There is sort of a lack of regulation, and then people forget that everybody was predicting the crisis to occur in the hedge fund industry that is completely unregulated. If there is a part of the financial market that worked relatively well, was the hedge fund industry. People went sort of bust, but there wasn't like much of a turmoil. The crisis happened in the most regulated sector in the world, so it probably is lack of regulation, but it's not obvious that with regulation you do much better. And then my favorite interpretation is greed. Now, of course, sort of greed is at the basis of what we think is economics. So it's sort of say that it's caused by greed is they say, okay, it's caused by the fact that people are alive. So I don't think that any of that is really a good interpretation. So what I try to do it is try to say, okay, I want to tell you what I learned from this crisis that I didn't think before. I'm not saying that moral hazard I knew is important, play a role, but it's not that this crisis really enlightened me and say, oh, moral hazard is a problem. I knew it before. I've not learned anything. And I knew that there are problems in regulation, there are problems in credit rating agency, there are problems in Fannie and Freddie, there are problems in all the things, and there's problems in executive compensation. All these things are important. I don't think there are things that, first of all, cause the crisis by itself. And number two, it's nothing that I can say a year later, I learned this, and now I'm going to do economics, or I'm going to teach my students in a different way as a result of the crisis. So what do I really learn about in the crisis? One is how fragile are financial markets to big, irrational players. And, speaking of limits of our models, two fundamental assumptions that generally we have in financial markets modeling is that players are rational and they are atomistic. And we can easily live with one of the two failing. This is if players are big, generally sort of in economics we call that oligopoly, they are not atomistic. Financial market generally doesn't change dramatically, but as long as they act in their own self-interest and all the right incentives, etc., that's not a big problem. And vice versa, if there are some irrational players, that's not a big deal. Since in finance we have arbitrage, we don't rely on everybody being rational. We rely that the smart people have enough money that they can offset the sort of irrational, I don't want to use the term stupid, but irrational people. Now, what is problematic if you have both at the same time? If you have some large players that at the same time don't play according to the usual rule of the game. And I'm not saying necessarily they are irrational, I'm just saying they don't play according to the usual rule of the game. So who are these players? First of all, I think the first one was China. China was a big investor in financial markets, an investor that was driven by not necessarily the same economic interest that we model everybody to act. They were obsessed, if you want, to have sort of AAA securities. And they wanted to invest all their surplus in AAA securities. And if there is one thing that finance knows how to do well, is repackage stuff that looks like what you want. This is, what do you want? You want AAA security? I can produce a lot of AAA security for you. Now, what is interesting is that they did it in a way that, and I know I'm going to take some grief for saying that, but in a way that is not completely sort of illogical, or everybody has accused them of being corrupt, etc. And of course, there were cases of corruption, etc. But overall, what they did is simply trying to produce the securities in the way that the existing technology, the existing models allow them to produce. And clearly what they did is they maximize on what we call sort of a model risk. So what is the market, what is the time series? Why, have you asked yourself the question why we're not seeing sort of an overflooding of corporate loans? Why so much risk in the housing market? It's because we have much better data on corporate loans. And so we know, well, much better maybe is an exaggeration, but we know better their characteristic, and we know it's very difficult to manufacture corporate loans that are AAA. In the housing market, because the last 75 years had basically a straight line up, you had legitimate data that were justifying crazy results, okay? And it didn't take sort of a genius to look at the picture of the housing market in the United States and saying, there is something funny going on here. And so when you ask yourself the question and say, why so many smart people, and the vast majority of them, I think with the right incentives, and the vast majority of them sort of honest, did not see what even a 3-year-old kid will see, that if something goes up like a rocket, eventually will fall down. And that's the picture of the housing market in the United States. Why people have failed? And the answer is because the market's incentives are very good, as Professor Durman said, in exploiting arbitrage, in pricing what Larry Summers called catch-up economics. So we're very good at saying that the price of the 6 ounces bottle of ketchup is twice as much as the price of the 8 ounces of ketchup. Now, this is not true at the supermarket because there are some packaging costs, but it is true in finance because packaging costs are, by a large approximation, close to zero. So it is true that you have this arbitrage. And all incentives are perfect in getting this stuff right, but there are very few people who actually pay to get the price of ketchup overall right. And even if you do, it's very difficult to take advantage of that, especially if you have a large player in the market going maybe the other way. And as a lot of my colleagues said, you can become sort of very poor before you are proven to be right. And people don't like to wait that amount of time. So we don't have a lot of incentives in the market to get the price equal to fundamental. We have a lot of incentives to get the arbitrage away from the system. So the system works well if there is not a mega force that pushes us off balance. And this force could be China, could be institutional investors that are obsessed with having some particular type of securities, or could be, like that was the internet bubble, a bunch of people getting overexcited about sort of a sector. And when you have a herd moving, the market is actually not very good in getting that right. Now, it doesn't mean necessarily that the government is much better in getting it right, but it does make you pause about sort of, for example, Greenspan and Bernanke view that by under no circumstance the Fed should lean against the wind and try to sort of pick a bubble, because I think that markets are weak in that dimension. The second thing I learned is the fragility of the banking sector. And you say, you know, you didn't discover anything, and it's true that banks are subject to run. We have seen this even in popular movies like It's a Wonderful Life. We have seen it in a lot of historical evidence. And we are sort of reminded in our courses all the time about banks run. However, honestly, and this is maybe my mistake and people here might not have shared, I thought this was a thing of the past. I thought that FDIC insurers had cured that, and the risk of a bank run was something that could happen in underdeveloped countries or could happen in England because they didn't have FDIC insurance, but in this country it could not happen. And coherent to this view, I never withdrew any more than my usual $100 for my grocery during the crisis. I was absolutely sort of relying on the banking system, and I actually had my account at Citigroup, believe it or not, because I trusted the FDIC insurance. Now, what brought this to life is a colleague of mine, and we'll go unnamed, but a colleague in the department, the colleague in the department more rational than the one in the business school, so the colleague in the department who told me that he actually withdrew a significant amount of money during the crisis, and he said, you know, even if eventually the FDIC will pay, suppose that over a weekend, both Citigroup and B of A go under. Do you think that the FDIC has the human capability to actually make sure that everything is paid on time the next day? And the answer is no, it doesn't. And so it is perfectly rational, as I said, my colleague in the department is extremely rational, it's perfectly rational to basically run for the exit. It's like in a movie theater when you see smoke, if everybody goes sort of slowly, it's rational to go slowly, but if you see people start rushing, it's perfectly rational to rush, even if you know that eventually you're going to bring down the place, but your individual incentives are actually to run. And I think that this is a serious issue and explains why we need to have some form of protection for the banking sector, but it also needs to say why we have to be careful that a lot of the financial system don't piggyback and exploit in a negative sense that protection. For example, I think it makes perfect sense that you have some deposits that are insured so that people don't have to worry about sort of what happened the next day. But it doesn't make any sense that money market funds have this commitment not to break the buck and are not traded at net asset value. Part of what caused the crisis last year is that there was literally a run on the reserve fund. Now, there was a run because people were trying to save the difference between 100 cents and 97.5 cents. So it's not that they were losing all their money, it's that they knew that the reserve fund had lost because they invested in Lehman, and they wanted to withdraw the money before it was too late, and that created 180 billion sort of withdrawal in the money market funds, and as a result, the government intervention to stop that, and so on and so forth. So I think that speaking of regulation, the fact that today the SEC is still allowing money market fund not to trade at net asset value, I think is crazy and should be fixed. Because the first rule is you should have a minimum amount of things that are guaranteed. Everything else, people should recognize that there is some risk involved and take that risk with them. The other thing that I learned is that there is in the system under provision of liquidity. Everybody takes for granted the liquidity marketplace, but when problems arise, the marketplace is not liquid and there is not enough sort of liquidity. And I think that this is one problem we need to solve from a regulatory point of view, because there are incentives that are really misaligned. People underinvest in liquidity, and that is what brings about sort of crises that everybody say are 3 standard deviation or 6 standard deviation, but they happen too frequently to be 3 sigma or 6 sigma crises. I think that are crises that are created by the fact that people try to exploit the system to their best sort of to the best of their ability, and there is not enough provision of liquidity in the system. The last thing, and then I really terminate, the last thing I learned is how understaffed is the US government, especially in a moment of crisis. I don't know whether you have read sort of the David Wessel book, In the Fed We Trust. It's a beautiful book. But it's scary because you realize that you have the most powerful government in the world, running the most important financial system in the world, and basically without any intellectual support. The decisions are made one day after the other, and says, I love, speaking of Lehman Brothers, I love the story that the market participants meet on the Saturday before the Lehman collapse, and they ask the Fed and the Treasury, says, we are here for Lehman, but what about AIG? And Paulson say, AIG is tomorrow's problem. So we have the most powerful government in the world solving problems one day at a time with no strategy, no thinking, no economic theory behind it.
Thank you. Our next speaker is Professor Yu, who is an academician with the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, the Director General of the Institute of World Economics and Politics, President of the China Society of World Economics, editor of China and World Economy, and a whole number of other important positions. He was formerly the academic member of the Monetary Policy Committee of the People's Bank of China and member of the National Advisory Committee of the 11th Five-Year Plan of National Reform and Development. Professor Yu is the author of a large number of books and articles on macroeconomics, international finance, and other subjects in a whole variety of mediums also. His main research interests are macroeconomics and world economics. Professor Yu.
Thank you. It's a great honor to be here. And I want to introduce myself by another title, Dollar Killer. Because over the past 5 or 6 years, I warned the Chinese government about the danger of the continuation to accumulate foreign exchange reserves and so on. And each time I say something about the dollar, then dollar will drop. So I got this name. And I think Lehman Brothers fiasco actually is really a very important event. And to be honest, I remember I think in September 14th last year, we had a meeting with the high-ranking government officials. We were asked about our opinion about the subprime crisis whether it will be improved or things will go worse. And the most economists at the time told the Chinese leadership U.S. economy was bottoming out, things will turn better, and so on. At very evening, Lehman Brothers collapsed. The situation suddenly changed. So China's economic fortune changed in that month. Up until that time, China's growth is still very strong. China's growth rate is still something like 10% annualized, and the inflation rate is 7% something. But from December to October, situation suddenly changed. The growth rate dropped dramatically. Give one example. Most heated sector in China is the steel sector. China's steel production dropped dramatically, not drop in growth rate, but the absolute amount. And according to our calculation, more than 53% of drop of steel production can be attributed directly to the reduction in external demand, which is a direct result of the global slowdown. And this global slowdown can be attributed directly to Lehman Brothers fiasco. So we learned a very hard lesson. Previously, Chinese economists are very pro-American model. Everything American is correct, and China should copy, should learn as much as possible. Before Lehman Brothers, to talk about the asset bubble was sort of a taboo in China. You can't imagine that. China is supposed to be a socialist country. It's rather sometimes I try to raise the issue of asset bubble, but each time I feel I was isolated, so I shut up. I don't talk. But now situation changed. We are thinking about a model which is not exactly the same of U.S. model. Of course, China will carry on with the reform and opening up. But we really want to find a good model which is really suitable to China's economic situation. And we realize that the U.S. model is not perfect. Here I just want to introduce some debates in China about the cause of financial crisis. Before Lehman Brothers, before subprime crisis, the most important debate in China is global imbalances. I think the same was true here. And at the time, we were expecting that because accumulation of foreign debt of the U.S. government, following the increase in foreign debt over GDP ratio, investors' confidence on U.S. financial market will wane. Then people will stop to continue to buy treasury bills, so on and so forth. So the cut-off of capital inflows into U.S. Financial market will cause a collapse of the U.S. dollar. Then it will cause trouble for China because China already accumulated a huge amount of foreign exchange reserves. At the time, China's foreign exchange reserve is something like $1 trillion. Actually, I involved in this debate since 1996, long time ago. And when we won the possibility of a collapse of the US dollar, at the time China's foreign exchange reserve is $1 trillion. Only after 3 years it became $2 trillion, so fast. But anyway, at the time we fear the collapse of US dollar caused by a cut-off of capital inflows in US financial market. But now we know that the crisis is not caused by the collapse of US dollar. The crisis, at least at this stage, is not a currency crisis. It's a financial crisis. It's a crisis triggered by subprime bubble. I think this is the same as lots of a bubble which happened in history. For example, tulip bubble, South Sea bubble, and stock exchange bubble in 20s and so on. I think all these bubbles have some common characteristics, features. Of course, people now don't want to talk about greedy, human nature, and so on. But I think this is one important reason, because of course human perhaps are greed, but the greediness is different in different period of time. I think since 90s, maybe since the collapse of Soviet Union, because people see the triumph of capitalism. So I think the greed, people's greed, run amok without any constraint. I think this is something really is fundamental. I think as scholars in cultural, religion, psychology should study this issue, and this is important because people become greedy, so they want to create lots of things to earn quick money. Secondly, I think this has something to do with so-called financial liberalization. I think financial liberalization is okay, but we have gone too far. Financial innovation runs loose, no control at all. And I'm not expert in financial instruments. Actually, I spend months to study these kind of complicated financial instruments, even though I'm not entirely illiterate in mathematics, but I feel it's so difficult to understand. And so, for example, we can understand MBS, CDO, and maybe a CDO square, CDO cubed, CD, and so on and so forth. The model is so complicated, so we can talk about regulation, yes, and we can talk about transparency, but I don't know whether there is enough competent government officials who can understand these kind of complicated financial instruments. So I think we should have some strict ban on this kind of so-called financial innovation. For example, first order derivatives of financial instruments may be okay, but second order, the third order should be banned. It has nothing to do with the reality. We just cannot control it. And also shorting. We know the shorting is very harmful, but we still allow shorting to carry on. I think we should put some constraint on these kind of activities. For example, if I'm the regulator, I will decide it in China, stock exchange can open for the other day. You can't trade every day and so on. Or sometimes we just shut down stock exchange to allow people to have a rest, so on and so forth. Anyway, we can do something to constrain this kind of speculation. And people talk about the nepotism of East Asian countries. But the most important factor which really caused huge problem during the Asian financial crisis is the shorting by international speculators. Nobody said a thing about financial speculation, just criticize Eastern Asian country. I think that's not fair. And I just talk about the macro basis of this financial crisis. But I think there's another very important factor, that is U.S. Federal Reserve has adopted a wrong policy for too long. That is monetary policy is too loose and keeps interest rate so low, so that which create conditions for those kind of financial innovation to run loose, to allow this bubble to increase. If U.S. government has not adopted this kind of very loose monetary policy, I don't think the situation will be so bad. So interest rate is federal funds rate and so on. It's an important factor which contributes to the assets bubble and the burst bubble and the financial crisis. But I think to be fair, according to Greenspan, the most important interest rate for the bubble, housing bubble, is not the federal funds rate, it's a long-term rate, fixed mortgage rate, and so on. I think he's correct in this regard. Then I can come back to the old issue of global imbalances. Why U.S. government can maintain a very low interest rate? Really, China and other East Asian countries has something to do with this. And of course, the U.S. government and also lots of U.S. economists point their finger to China, to accuse China of wrongdoing. I think this is unfair because I'm in Columbia University, it's not a place for me to criticize Chinese government. So I will defend Chinese government. I will not criticize it. When I come back, I can do this. But here, I just want to say that it has something to do with the problem of international financial institution, especially international monetary system. I think Joe has made a very important contribution to this debate because the arrangement, because this so-called post-Bretton Woods system, developing country has to accumulate foreign exchange reserves so that they can ensure when they are under attack, they can maintain financial stability. Actually, when I wrote an article to persuade the Chinese government to reduce foreign exchange reserves in later 1990s, the article, published official article, against me is that we need to accumulate foreign exchange reserves. Because if we don't have foreign exchange reserves, Chinese economy will be attacked. Then there's no way for us to get out of trouble. I think there's some point. I think it's not entirely wrong, not entirely correct. I would say that because China has capital control, so on and so forth. But anyway, Bernanke is wrong to accuse the so-called saving glut as a cause of a financial crisis in the United States. This is unfair. But anyway, we realize that the current international monetary system is fundamentally flawed because US dollar, this is the national currency, serve at the same time as the core reserve currency. This is a fundamental problem with the current monetary system. And together with this most important feature, this system failed to solve three problems. Number one, liquidity problem. Sometimes it's caused deflation, sometimes it causes inflation. Second, adjustment. Under this system, there isn't any adjustment. For example, US government run, US run current account deficit for more than 26 years without change. You can carry on with this. And China also run more than 15 years current account surplus. And you cannot force us to change our attitude, right? And if there was, say, a gold standard, then the adjustment will be immediate. Of course, gold standard has its own problem. What I'm trying to say is that the current system is flawed in terms of adjustment mechanism. There isn't adjustment mechanism. Of course, the last one is confidence. Confidence is waning. Confidence on US dollars is waning. Now we are facing three problems. This is why recently Chinese government raised the issue of the safety of Chinese foreign exchange reserves. Number one, because US government is using very expansionary monetary policy. We know excess reserve increased from 3 billion to something like 800 billion. And helicopter ban dropping money without a limit. Secondly, you are running very big budget deficit. Currently, you have 11.7 trillion debt. Now, within 10 years, you will add another 9 trillion. So the debt over GDP ratio will reach 120%. This is your official estimation, which is as bad as Japan. But Japan is a high-saving country. They can finance their budget deficit by their own. You have to rely on foreign people, foreign investors. You rely on China to continue to buy your treasury bills. By the way, at this time, you try to impose a sanction against China's export so that China cannot earn enough foreign exchanges, so that China cannot continue to buy your treasury bills. This is the dilemma you are facing. Anyway, the third one is that because the first one is there's a danger for dollar to devalue because the very high foreign debt over GDP ratio. This ratio is continuing to rise. So we are facing three problems: the drop of US dollar, the drop of the price of treasury bills, and potentially inflation. If any of these happened, then China's 2 trillion foreign exchange reserve will down the drain in a very big way. So I agree with Krugman. He said China fell into a dollar trap. If there's really something happened with the dollar, then we will suffer greatly. So we have to try to get out of this, this trap. Of course, this has become very difficult. More difficultly because I don't have enough time. So I have to just say a few words within 1 minute. We support the reform of international monetary system. Governor Zhou has come out, wrote a very good article. I fully support this. And secondly, China will adjust its growth strategy. Export-oriented and strategy is wrong. We should change this. And also, China should not really rely on investment-driven. We should make change and so on. Then China will carry out reform in 3 fronts in terms of international finance. Number 1, China will continue to support the reform international financial system. Secondly, China will promote internationalization of RMB. Thirdly, China will strengthen the cooperation with the East Asian countries, including Japan. Try to form kind of not Asian currency, but something like that. So we can make effort in these 3 fronts. By doing this, definitely the domination of US dollar will be weakened. I think this is in the interest of China as well as in the interest of the United States. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Joseph Stiglitz, university professor at Columbia University. He is very well known through his books, the Nobel Prize winner for economics in 2001 for his analysis of markets with asymmetric information and his role in creating a new branch of economics, the economics of information. Currently, he is deeply involved in a number of, that we call it, say, real-world projects. He's been named to the President Nicolas Sarkozy's to chair a commission on the measurement of economic performance and economic progress. I think you are the co-president or co-chief of the United Nations Commission,
Chair.
Right? Yes, chair, right?
And you is, he's a member.
Yes, that's right. That is right. I was sort of, and I think the latest book is The $3 Trillion War, if I have that right, which was co-authored with Linda Bilmes and published in 2008.
Let me try to be brief so we can have some time for discussion. And as Luigi said, everybody, the crisis is a Rorschach test. We always see in it what we want to see. Obviously, financial markets, core function is information, which is a subject in which I've spent a lot of time. And I think looking at the financial markets, I think we have to say that they really failed. They failed to perform the critical functions that they are supposed to perform. And I think that's really the beginning point of thinking about where we are and where we need to be. They failed, what are they supposed to do? They're supposed to allocate capital, manage risk, and do it with low transaction cost. Our financial markets misallocated capital massively. No government outside of war has probably misallocated the capital as badly as our private sector has done. It created risk, and it had huge transaction costs. A third of corporate profits were in the financial sector. We confused finance, which is supposed to be a means to an end of more productive economy, with an end in itself. A lot of discussion about the innovativeness of our financial sector, but much of the innovation was directed at circumventing regulations, circumventing accounting standards, tax arbitrage. When it came to the core responsibilities, it actually resisted innovations. There were innovations that would enable, what is the most important asset that most people have? It's their home. There were innovations that would have mitigated the risk of home ownership. The Danish mortgage bonds, they resisted these innovations. When I was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, they resisted the introduction of bonds that mitigated the risk of inflation because their incentives are associated with generating transaction costs, fees, not with helping people address their needs. And that goes to the core issue of incentives. and that the incentive structures of the institution and of the individuals don't correspond to societal incentives. Just to give you one example that has not been talked about, but I think it's reflective of how bad our financial system is. Modern technology allows for the creation of an efficient electronic payments mechanism that would require the cost of transferring money from your bank account to a store's bank account when you go in and purchase of a fraction of a penny. And yet our financial system uses its monopoly power to charge 1, 2, 3% of the value of the transaction. A few governments have intervened and said, you know, this is anti-competitive and have stopped this, but U.S. government and many other governments, most governments have not. The hardest question when we deal with the crisis is parsing out responsibility and you know, recognizing that it's really, as Luigi said, interaction of several failures together that really causes the worst problems. But to pick up on a couple of things that several of the panelists have raised, the issue of to what extent is the Fed responsible because it allowed for supported excessively low interest rates. Now, when you think about it for a second, what firm would say, go to its shareholders and say, the reason we were so inefficient, incompetent, was our workers were willing to work at too low of a wage. And because they were willing to work at too low of a wage, we mismanaged. Now, if you did that, and management came and said that to you, you'd say, you're out of your mind. But what is the major input into the financial sector? Capital. And they're saying the problem of their mismanagement was the Fed provided capital at too low of a price. And it's absurd that we accept that as an explanation. If our financial system had been doing what it's supposed to be doing, which is directing capital to where it should have gone, low cost of capital would have been the basis of a more efficient economy, a dynamic growth, but they failed. And you know, we can go into asking why they failed, but they clearly failed. And you can't blame the Fed for low interest rates. You can blame the Fed for inadequate regulation. But again, even in the area of regulation, it's sort of like somebody, can you imagine a trial of a murder where the murderer says, it wasn't my fault, the policeman didn't stop me. But that's our financial system. It said, the reason we killed the economy is the regulator wasn't there to stop me from behaving badly. So yes, they weren't there, but, and this goes to the issue of political economy, they paid the policeman not to be there. They spent hundreds of millions of dollars on lobbying to make sure the policeman wasn't there. And then lo and behold, the policeman's not there, and they blame the policeman for not being there. We appointed, and it was a strategy, appointing regulators who didn't believe in regulation. We had a very good central banker from the perspective of the standard view of central banking, which is keeping inflation rates down. Volcker brought down inflation from double-digit levels to single-digit levels in the early 80s. And what, you know, we talk about accountability, what was his reward? He was fired. We should be blunt about what happened. Why was he fired? Because he believed in regulation, and Reagan didn't like regulation. He wanted somebody who didn't believe in regulation. He found somebody in Greenspan. Now, I don't think you should blame Greenspan, because he would have found somebody else who didn't believe in regulation. There are lots of people out there who don't believe in regulation. And it was that theory, and the models based on that theory that supported this whole disaster. Well, let me say that what is interesting about the crisis in some ways is that in many ways, it's just like a lot of the crises we've had before. As everybody said, we had bubbles. The fact that we thought that we no longer would have bubbles, to me, is amazing. But what is so interesting is that even in the diagnosis, I think there's some I think there's a lot to be learned. For instance, to some extent, there was a lot of irrationality, and that's what Greenspan said, the flaw in his model. But there were two other problems. The first is that we created institutions that were too big to fail, and they knew that they were too big to fail, and it was therefore in their incentive to gamble. Heads I win, tails you lose, and they did that, and we lost. So it wasn't totally irrational. They were doing what was in their interest. Second point, even if there was no institution that was too big to fail, we could have had this crisis. Why? Because a simple idea that we lecture on all the time, but Greenspan still and others who believe in free markets don't understand, there are externalities. The actions of the financial system have had enormous externalities on the rest of the economy. The actions of the US have had enormous externalities on the rest of the world, including China. The actions of particular financial institutions have enormous externalities on other financial institutions. And that means that when there are these externalities, individuals in the pursuit of their self-interest do not act in societal interest. So without reference to greed, without reference to irrationality, you can explain a lot of what went on. I think irrationality did make it worse, but even without those problems, the problems could have occurred, and they occurred partly because they were using similar models which led to correlated behavior, which meant that when they all wanted to sell their assets, the price of the assets go down, and that is, of course, an old problem of bubbles and bubbles breaking. Well, it is true. Let me make just two more comments very briefly. One is, where are we today? In many ways, because we haven't learned these lessons, I think our financial market is, in some respects, in worse shape. I mean, of course, everybody's been burned, and right after the fingers are still sore from being burned, and so they're not willing to gamble quite as much. But if you look at the structure of the system, the too big to fail banks have become even bigger. And very little has been done to do anything about these too big to fail banks. There's a promise that we will do something, but so far, very little. Our banks are also, it's not just too big to fail, it's also too intertwined, and that's the story about AIG. And again, we haven't done anything about that. Lack of transparency. The proposal is to allow over-the-counter non-transparent credit default swaps to continue to be traded. Let me just mention, this is one illustration of how deeply irrational and stupid the financial markets have been, but at the same time illustrates the fact that they had incentives not to be fully rational. Let me give you an example. Before the crisis, there were these numbers of exposure, gross credit default swaps that were in the trillions. And, when things collapsed, Lehman collapsed, there were lots of problems of netting out. And one of the questions is, why didn't they net out before? The netting out is if A bet B something on the death of Bank C, and then then they decide to cancel that debt. Rather than cancel, that would be easy. B decides to bet A the reverse direction, and so it nets out. So you say, well, what difference does it make if we net out? Well, it makes a very big difference if one of the two parties goes bankrupt, because then if one of the two parties goes bankrupt, A owes B, but B no longer owes A because B is it may not be able to pay. So you ask them, why didn't you net out? Knowing this counterparty risk, as it's called, and everybody knew about counterparty risk. And then they said, oh, we couldn't imagine the counterparties going bankrupt. But then you ask, what were the securities they were trading on? They were secreting on bets on the death of these other banks. So it was like they're totally schizophrenic. And this is just one of many elements of schizophrenia. Deep, it's not just irrationality, it's deep irrationality inside the market. Well, as I say, I don't think I think our financial system in some ways is worse, partly because we've allowed the too big to fail banks to get bigger, and because we've introduced a new concept that we didn't have before the crisis. Not only do we have banks that are too big to fail, we've said that they're too big to be financially resolved. We are bailing out bondholders, bailing out shareholders, and so we've really made the bailout, the moral hazard problems worse. I do agree with the statement that it is amazing the lack of competence and lack of support of the Federal Reserve, their inability to understand what was going on. And this is part of the ideology of stripping down government so that it can't do anything. And now we see when we needed the government, it really wasn't able to do it. But I do want to end on the point that we should recognize that even if Lehman Brothers hadn't gone bankrupt, that our economy was headed for serious problems. It's a symptom of the unwinding of the bubble, not the cause of the unwinding of the bubble. And that what had sustained the American economy before the crisis was the bubble. And the American economy helped sustain the global economy. And that's why the discussions of the economy being over, that we're on the road to health. Yes, we are much better than we were at the precipice, but the fundamental problems of lack of aggregate demand, including the need for reserves, because we haven't yet fixed the global reserve system, remain. We haven't even begun to touch those fundamental problems. And the level of diagnosis remains problematic. So, for instance, when we talk about unemployment, we're using seasonally adjusted numbers, but seasonal adjustments ought to be adjusted for the cycle. But we don't have enough data to do that. If we had actually looked at the real numbers of the number of people who've been discharged from their job, have lost their job, and without the seasonal adjustment, we would be much more scared about going the future than we currently are.
Thank you very much. That was very clear. Now, we are really almost there, so I wonder whether we could have a very quick, each panelist just comment on what if there is something that you profoundly agree with or profoundly disagree with each other, or something along those lines, and then we will get some questions from the audience. Yes.
Yeah, I kind of agree with what Professor Stiglitz said, but I think just to amplify on it, I think that the real problem is sort of the moral problem, in that economics is supposed to be a political and moral science, and I was brought up believing in risk and reward, and all the correlation between risk and reward has vanished as a result of the bailout and of what people have been doing. And until that's restored, and I'm not really a moralist, but until people take their so-called punishment for having made bad bets, it's impossible to restore things.
Can I just add one thing about that? One of the curious things at the political level is the Fed clearly didn't do its job in regulation, and so now what is the proposal for how to deal with the problem? Give the Fed more power. Yeah. That seems very strange to me.
Also, I was going to say, I think that all that lowering of interest rates over the last 10 years was, to some extent, a way of trying to avoid giving people the reward of having made bad bets, and their lowering interest rates should have been, I don't want to say a punishment, but it was a way of preventing people from suffering what they should have suffered as a result of the previous mini crises.
So that would sort of serve as a structurally embedded kind of regulation. You don't have a policy apparatus, but you embed it in how...
I mean, every time things were about to go bad, they lowered interest rates. And then, they pushed the problem downhill until it got bigger and bigger.
Exactly.
I completely agree with Joe about both sort of the importance of the moral hazard problem and the evil that is coming out of sort of the power, the lobbying power of the financial industry that has really sort of made the system much less efficient. But however, I don't agree with what Professor Yu said about sort of shorting being harmful and we should ban innovation. I think that, first of all, when I was saying about the market, one thing that is very difficult for the market is to get the price right. And one of the few instruments we have to bring bad information to light is actually shorting. And shorting is harmful for corporate managers because it exposes the problems that they have. Shorting is harmful if you own a lot of stock because it exposes the problem that is in the stock. But is the most efficient way we have to reward collection of information, which is crucial in trying to allocate capital. So I think that the problem we have is that we have too little shorting, not too much shorting. On the time of...
Should we stop on that point just for a minute? Because I think that is an important issue. Can I just give my view on that? Maybe,
absolutely.
I think you're absolutely right that in many ways some of the short selling has been one of the important disciplines. And it was very interesting when the banks were having trouble. What are the two things that they ran to the regulators and said we need to do? One was, let's change the accounting so no one knows how bad things are, which they did. And the other one is, let's make sure that those people who know how bad we are can't have a voice in the market. On the other hand, I'm going to say, there are two aspects of shorting, and some of this has showed up in the international scale, where it's been very harmful. One of them is when I make a bet that Bear Stearns is going to die, I have an incentive to make sure that Bear Stearns dies. In the area of insurance markets, we don't allow people to have, that we say to buy an insurance policy, you have to have an insurable risk. Because otherwise you have incentives that may be a little bit perverse, like accelerating their death. So I think that's at least one concern. Secondly, and it goes to a broader thing of trying in a world of imperfect information to get bad information or distort information that leads to the fulfillment of your bet. The second one is that certainly those of us who watched the East Asia crisis did see some really bad behavior on the part of American banks. There was something which called the double play, the Hong Kong double play, where they both took a position on the exchange rate and on the stock market.
Index.
On the stock market index. And with the view that their view was that if the government responded to the exchange rate, they would raise the interest rate,
yes.
the stock market would go down.
Or they shorted the stock.
So they shorted the stock, and they thought they could, had a no-lose situation. When Hong Kong decided not to play by the ordinary rules, and the government intervened in the market and supported the stock market, made huge amounts of money. You should have heard the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, Rubin, and said, this is, that it was like, this is not fair. Our companies were supposed to be able to conspire to make money off of you, and you changed the rules, and now we've lost money, and we're angry. It was an enormous negative response. So there are lots of examples like that where shorting has been used, I think, in a very negative way. Maybe you want to...
Yeah. Please.
Sorry, Joe, but it seems that you are confirming my views. And so it was not bad for the American banks to do that. It was bad for Rubin to speak in their behalf. I think that's a problem. The problem is the political influence of the banking and financial industry. It's not per se the shorting. We need shorting, and banning sort of shorting of banks was terrible, and banning sort of shorting in the future would be terrible.
Professor Yu.
Okay. Actually, I'm not an expert on this kind of financial details. I'm not in a position to comment your counter argument. What I'm trying to say is based on my experience. Actually, I spent 1 month during the Asian financial crisis in Hong Kong to do the investigation. I think Joe's description about the event roughly is correct, but not precise. There are some complications. But anyway, shorting was used by international speculators to attack Hong Kong dollar just for get profits. This is daylight robbery. And the shorting allowed them to rob people. I think it's entirely unjustified, immoral. I think government should, international community, not just one government cannot do that, at least to control it. I'm not entirely against all shorting, but anyway, we should put certain constraint on it. I think you are expert, you know better. And another thing is that recently in China, we try to copy Anglo-Saxon model to encourage people to buy shares and so on. So in a sense, because we are a good student of the United States, too good. So lots of people become professional speculators. So Chinese stock market to a certain extent become a casino. I think that's very harmful. Financial is supposed to be a medium of resource allocation to help real economy. I don't think this is really a value create. I entirely agree with Joe. You fail to create any value. I mean, you increase transaction costs. You count this cost as sort of value, as part of GDP. I think it's entirely wrong. We should do something to change this.
I think, Joe, you have already said, or is there something in particular very short that you
I
want?
feel bad about cutting off Luigi. He was.
No, that's fine.
Luigi, did you not finish?
No, there was an issue about sort of banning financial innovation. I think that.
Oh, you're right. Yes.
Exaggeration.
Yes.
Yeah, it's a bit dangerous, and I think that there are a lot of drugs that did harm. We're not saying we should ban financial.
No. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one of the suggestions that's come out and is some people are pushing is a Financial Product Safety Commission, which says that, like drugs, you want to be sure that they're safe and efficacious before you allow ordinary citizens to take care of them. One of the failures of our financial regulatory model was the belief that if we just protect small people, then everybody else can take care of themselves and the system will be stable. I think we now know that that's not probably true.
We didn't even protect small people, because if we did, they wouldn't have like the no interest loans and all that stuff. I think that we should extend. We have a system now that if I am a broker and I sell you a security that you don't understand, I have to take it back. And the same should be true for mortgages. And I think that there was a big advantage of having a fixed rate mortgage, because help people doing financial planning. Most people are not good at doing financial planning, and I think that going back to that would not be a bad idea.
I just wanted to say something about financial innovation too. I'm not a big fan of very complex derivative products, but most of them at least rest on some underlier. Whereas you ever invented fiat money, you invented something that's a derivative of nothing tangible at all. And I don't think any investment bank would have had the courage to do that.
I think we have time for one question, maybe two questions from the audience. Yes, I see. All right. We'll just ask it. Yes?
I guess a lot of these topics are very debatable, and you can go into depth on them, whether it be derivatives, volatility trading, CDS, whatever. Specifically, what I wanted to ask is, since you all have political positions, what are the trends that you're seeing? What kind of scares you? How do we not become over-regulated? Clearly, to the extent you can share that, that would be very interesting.
Okay, hold on the answers. Question, yes?
I'd like to go back to the last comment, and I'd say that
Speak a bit louder.
casinos are rational, the market isn't, and the question is to go back to a point that Saskia said earlier about the concern about believing, and your comments too, that the market can be understood and subject to, if not theory, very strong models. I think we have firm evidence that the markets are not subject to this, and that all this talking about the irrationality in the markets, we should all be not surprised. Markets are inherently irrational.
Shall we answer these two questions?
I don't have any political position, so.
All right.
Okay, sure. Let me give a view, at least, about where the political process nationally and internationally is going, including in G20. I think one of the lessons people understand is that we need to have globally comprehensive regulation, because in a world of globalization, people can buy and sell over the internet internationally, and it's very hard. You can have global arbitrage unless you have some degree of harmonization. And that's why the G20 is trying to work towards some degree of harmonization. But here you have the problem that good regulation should be painful. If the regulation isn't constraining, then the regulation isn't doing anything. So the problem is that each country is under a lot of political pressure from its financial markets to design regulations that are not constraining. And so each of them are looking for the regulations that are easiest for them and hardest for the competitors abroad. So the result of this is, for instance, to give you one example, the U.S. is talking a lot about leverage because European banks are more leveraged than American banks. But Europe is pushing back on that. Europe has taken on the issue of incentive schemes much more seriously. And, while incentive schemes are not the only problem, it's very hard for one to be an economist and to say incentives don't matter. And if you have incentives that lead people to short-sighted behavior and excessive risk-taking, you should expect to see short-sighted behavior and excessive risk-taking. And that goes into a whole set of issues that we haven't talked about, that Luigi's written about, corporate governance and how you get incentive structures that are so flawed that didn't serve the shareholders and bondholders well. The point is the U.S. is resisting regulations on the incentive side. France, for instance, is much more committed, I think, to doing something about that. Real difference in the passion with which they will do something. So far, I don't see anything effective being done on the issue of size. And that's where really the political economy becomes very serious. I testified in Congress, and it was very interesting because there were three of us from a whole range of political spectrum saying that this was one of the critical issues. And yet, so far, as far as I know, no government really has undertaken effective measures to deal with it.
Oh yeah, I just wanted to say two things. One, to agree with this gentleman, that everybody talks as though they know what speculation and investment are, and everybody talks as though they know what fair value is, but the truth is nobody has a clue what fair value is. And there's a quote by Fisher Black who said that fair value is somewhere between a half and twice the right price, and I think nobody really knows what it is. Even that says, you know what the right price is, so you don't. So it's very tricky, and the same thing, one person's speculation is other person's investment. It's like the famous statement about pornography saying, I know it when I see it. And the second thing I wanted to say on the political side, I think everybody alluded to this, but I think there's a separation of powers is better in that there's much too much cohabitation between corporations and government. If you look at all the dystopias of the past, people expected in 1984 or in Brave New World, they certainly foresaw consumer culture and government control of individuals, but not corporate control of governments, which I think is pretty strange, and that's part of the solution to all of this, I think.
I think we have to conclude, because I know there are classes. I teach in this institution, so I know that something happens at 2. This was really an extraordinary discussion. There are a number of key subjects we could not touch, but this is one of 4 panels. So the next event, which is on October 14th, same place, same time. Oh, it will be okay, on the website. The Great Recession in Historical Perspective, and you're, of course, all invited. Let's thank all the speakers, and